I'm a backpacker. I've been pretty much all over the world, from the streets of Southeast Asia to the rolling meadows of Western Europe. But there was one spot that had up until recently eluded me. Australia. Well, I recently bit the bullet and booked my dream trip down under. I'd love to sit here and tell you about how incredible it was. How I saw some of the most amazing sights I had ever seen in my life. To a point, I suppose that's true. But I won't be going back there. You see, I've always been fascinated by the idea of the Australian outback, with its vast empty nothingness stretching as far as the eye can see. Something about getting yourself lost in its beauty. It's equal parts terrifying and exciting. So that's exactly what I plan to do. It's also why Australia had remained unattainable to me up until quite recently. I didn't want to do what every dime a dozen tourists did. I had no interest in seeing the sights of the cities. I mean, I'm sure they're beautiful in their own right. But for me, I wanted to get out into the wilds as quickly as possible. I did some research beforehand, jumped onto some local Aussie backpacking travel groups on Facebook, and I ended up getting quite friendly with a local. His name was Chris, and he was part Indigenous Australian, Aboriginal dad, and his mother of Irish heritage. We got to talking, and upon hearing all about my wishes to see the more secluded sights of Australia, he agreed to be my tour guide for the trip. All right, all was set. I flew into Sydney on a cold July morning. Yeah, that's their winter months down there. I was so excited as the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House slowly came into view as we descended beneath the clouds. I was right. The cities were beautiful in their own regard, but still, that's not what I was here to see. I met my tour guide Chris at the airport, and we hastily made our way to his vehicle, a stereotypical rusty Holden ute, and began the trek out west. The drive was bloody beautiful, and I highly recommend you try it at least once in your lifetime. We eventually cleared the western suburbs of Sydney, passing through Parramatta, Blacktown, and Penrith, before the urban scenery slowly began to give way to beautiful wide open spaces. Yeah, this is what I've been waiting for. The drive continued on for hours as we passed through quaint little outback communities, some of which genuinely looked like ghost towns. It was awe-inspiring to see the colors of this barren landscape change as we drove deeper toward the center. Brown, dry bushland interspersed with pockets of green slowly transitioning into hot red earth. I was mesmerized. It was a long drive out there, but I was so captivated by the sights I was seeing I honestly didn't notice. Eventually, just as night began to fall, we reached Broken Hill. This sprawling inland mining city deep in the heart of outback New South Wales was to be our base for exploring the remote wilderness of Mutawinji National Park. We would stay the night here in Broken Hill. It was too late to start the hike into the park, Chris explained to me. It was already creeping into the afternoon hours, and if we got caught in the dark too far from a good spot to make camp, that could spell real danger out there. I wasn't going to argue. He knew this place better than I did. I was excited to get out there and really start exploring. But I'd also had little sleep on the long haul down here, and I wasn't going to say no to a good night's rest. We checked into a quaint little hotel. Now, when I say hotel, I mean the Australian depiction of that term. If you're picturing the Hilton, think again. When Aussies say hotel, they mean the bare necessities you need in a room, situated on the second floor on top of a pub or bar, falling asleep to the sounds of drunken Australian men shouting at each other about two different types of football, neither of which I understand, was certainly something. but I was so tired at this point it didn't much of a barrier in my journey to slumber. A few pages into a good book, and I was out like a light. I awoke the next morning to the smells of breakfast and the sounds of my fellow guests shuffling their way down the stairs to dig into it. I was close behind them, ravenous after not eating very well at all the past couple of days. Aussies sure know how to start the day with a good breakfast. Well, a big one anyway. I don't imagine it would score too high a health rating. Mountains of bacon, sausage and eggs were loaded up onto a plate, and I was given a huge mug of coffee to wash it down with. I'm not really too big a fan of starting the day off with a heavy meal, but I got the feeling I wasn't in the best company to raise any complaints. After breakfast, I met up with Chris, and we loaded our gear into his ute. Before long, we were out on the open road again, surrounded by the endless red horizon. He wasn't wrong. This place was remote. It was a few hours' drive to the nearest entry point, and from there we were on foot. We had everything we needed in our packs, but still, there was something quite unnerving about trekking into such a vast open wasteland with not even a vehicle to retreat into should things go sideways. But this is what I came for, and I was going to see it through. That first step was something truly magical. The barely audible crunch of the soft top layer of dirt before my boots sunk into the red earth, it was surreal. I had waited so long to see this land, I couldn't quite believe I was actually here. Finally, the first day was full of little moments like that. The first time seeing a mob of kangaroos hop by in the distance. The first time smelling eucalyptus. The first time fearing for my life, as Chris threw an abrupt hand signal up in front of my face, just in time to stop me traipsing ignorantly into a large eastern brown snake's path. That sure got the blood up. And the first time seeing a billabong cresting the horizon after a full day of hiking. That was a sight to behold. It was around 4 or 5 in the afternoon by that point, so we decided to make camp for the night. It had been a long day, and I was starving. Thankfully, Chris had picked up a few recipes from his old man during his childhood years, growing up in a remote outback settlement. Bush tucker, they call it down there. Chris cooked up a hot stew, and we had that with what they call damper, the bread of the bush. It's actually really cool to see someone make bread using nothing but ingredients pulled straight from the land. It's made using wattle seed and saltbush. It's not much for the taste buds, but let me tell you, when you're out there with nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever the land grants you, being able to fill your belly with bread is a beautiful thing. It was a great way to end what had been an amazing start to my first venture into the Australian outback. We set up our camp beneath some gum trees, nearby that beautiful billabong. It was of course far too cold for any swimming, but the ambience was nice. There was a trickle in a nearby stream, and the crackle of the campfire had me off to sleep very quickly. It must have been close to, or maybe just past midnight, when I awoke from a sound sleep to a hand pressing against my mouth. This is obviously not a great way to wake up deep in the Aussie wilderness, and believe me, in that moment there were many thoughts of Australia's outback serial killers racing through my mind. But as it would happen, it was Chris. His eyes were wide, and he had a finger pressed against his lips, telling me in no uncertain terms to keep my mouth shut. I began to glance around, trying to find the source of Chris's sudden panicked state. Looking around, at first I didn't notice anything, just the vast expanse of the open outback in every direction. Nothing but darkness and the infinite void of this ancient land. What made this experience even more terrifying is that we didn't even have the cover of a tent. We were just camping out rough in our swags. I had no idea what to expect. I had visions of dangerous wild animals hunting us, circling in around us. That's when Chris lifted a single hand and pointed down toward the water hole and whispered one word, Nadubi. It took me a while in my sleepy state to process what I was looking at. In a flash, I was reminded of every sleep-deprived night spent as a kid after staying up late and watching my dad's scary werewolf films, for that is almost exactly what I was looking at here. It looked in every possible way, bar some subtle differences. Like a werewolf, it stood bolt upright on two jagged hind legs, its arms slumped down by its sides and its head hung downward, its scrunched up face molding into a slender snout, which looked more beak-like than that of a dog. It began to slowly creep around the water hole, my eyes remaining fixed on it the whole time. With each step the dry earth crunched beneath it, and each one of those sounds will forever remain burned into my memory, as with every one of them I thought for sure this thing was making its slow approach towards us. As it came closer to our side of the small pond, I began to notice more alarming features about this thing. It may have resembled a werewolf in form and posture, but that is where the similarities ended. Its entire body was covered in what looked to be sharp tendrils, like a porcupine. I watched as it sniffed at the still night air, I suppose searching for something it could call a meal. I don't know. I'm unsure what its purpose was, what its motives were, but by the look of it neither could have been good. Chris, ever so slowly and carefully, pulled the small swag blanket over the both of us, and we huddled there in place, hoping and praying that we would go unnoticed. For a series of very, very long hours, we lay there in the silence of the desolate Australian outback as we listened to this thing take measured paces around our camp. It just walked around, occasionally sniffing at our packs and some of the food we had left around camp. Intermittently, we would hear the unmistakable sounds of slurping. I guessed at that point it must have found itself some leftovers. Every so often it would retreat back over to the other side of the water hole, from what we could hear anyway, but would then return. It seemed like it was waiting for something. Perhaps it thought somebody might be coming back, for whatever reason unaware that we were right there beneath the thin swag blanket. It was undoubtedly the single most horrifying night of my life. The thoughts that were running through my mind after seeing this thing, thinking about what it could do to us with that nightmarish form it carried with it. It was beyond terrifying. We did not dare move that whole night. And it's a good thing, as it would, in the end, be the light of day which would arrive as our saviors. I guess it didn't much like the light, or perhaps the early morning heat it brought with it as it made its ascent, as we heard this thing very quickly run away as soon as the morning rays began making their way across our camp. It still took us another good hour before we could summon the bravery to emerge from our makeshift hiding spot. I almost wish we had not, as we rose from our tiny sanctuary and got a look at what had once been our tranquil little campsite. We were even more horrified than we had been the night before. We were greeted by the sight of many, many corpses. Lizards, possums, fish, snakes, even some kangaroos. Their bodies, lifeless. Seemingly, they were untouched. You wouldn't even know they had been attacked in any way, were it not for the small holes in their bellies and those disgusting slurping noises we had heard the night before. We made haste getting out of there. Needless to say, we stayed a night back in Broken Hill and set off for the drive back east the next morning. The drive back to Sydney was a lot more solemn than the one we had taken on the way out there. Chris barely spoke. I almost didn't want to break the silence, but there were questions on my mind. That thing was obviously not of this world, and yet he seemed to know exactly what it was at a glance. While not entirely certain, of course. Chris shared with me that what we had seen was most likely a Nadubi. It is an indigenous tale of a grotesque, echidna-like dog man which hunts by night. I didn't get much more out of him. He looked as shaken as I was, understandably so. Despite growing up hearing many of these stories, I could tell by his demeanor this was the first time he had encountered one firsthand. I did end up staying a few more nights in Sydney. Honestly, I was still in a state of shock. I probably would have been on the next flight out had I been in any state of mind to book one. But I just couldn't. So I stuck around until I could think straight. It wasn't all bad, I suppose. I ended up seeing a few sights around the city. I have a whole new appreciation for cities. Whilst I do still appreciate the blissful peace of the wilderness, I choose to admire it from afar. I have seen what lurks within the unexplored pockets of the Australian outback. I have seen why so many who venture too deep within fail to return. For those of you wishing to experience it for yourself, I will not tell you what to do. I will leave you with only one piece of advice: that you educate yourself, not only by the standards of modern humanity's limited knowledge of this land, but listen to the stories of those who have lived here since ancient times. Do not underestimate their wisdom. It may very well save your life.